as you can see, we have 3 different industries here. We've got telco/media, we've got legal, and we've got banking. And the whole point of putting this panel together is to give you a taste of how regulations and the regulators affect those different industries. And these are all experienced people who are going to tell you kind of the, the here and the then. So let's start with that. I wish I could give the brief history of, a nice little presentation of here's what regulations look like in the past and here's what they're looking like now. But that's something that's for another time. But I hope from the 3 different industries, and Carla, we'll start with you, you can tell us some of your own sense. What have you seen in the past, and how's that changed? Even an anecdote is fine.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the past, I think the regulations were very generic in nature, and the regulations were not that easily measurable, right? And then the measure is also much more focused on compliance, and do you have that or you don't have that? It is not about how effective or not. I don't think so we have gone to that yet, but I think right now most of the regulations are also consequences tied to it, right? Mm-hmm. If you don't meet certain things, or if you don't do certain things, there are penalties and consequences associated with it, right? I think we're moving from are we doing to what happens if we don't do. I think, yeah.
Can you give us an example of something in the past, on a regulation or some kind of activity in the past, and that in some kind of framework, and then today that's different? Any example you could think of, like something now you have to do you didn't have to do before, or?
I mean, I think a lot more regiment in terms of reporting breaches and reporting any incidents and reporting any losses in terms of records, right? To a point where different states have different laws to say if you lost a record, you report in this AG's office, and if you don't, how broad it can be, right? And how quickly that you're engaging the law enforcement, and what kind of diligence that you're doing, and kind of prescription in those from a breach perspective, right? So it's kind of
Arlen, legal is a little more self-regulated. So give us your experience with the then and now.
Yeah, the legal sector is in a regulated industry. That could be thought of as a good thing, but the reality is all of our clients come from highly regulated industry.
Good point.
So instead of not having any regulatory frameworks, we've got to pay attention to all of them, which is a wonderful position to be in. What have we seen over the years? I feel like I'm very much repeating much of what we've already heard today. The benefit of being last. In a nutshell, from my experience, I actually came from financial services, cut my teeth in my first half of my career in FS. What we've seen is a movement essentially to broader and more mature, kind of doesn't make sense, but what I mean by is originally what we saw is very specific regulatory frameworks or regulatory audits on specific point solutions, and now we're seeing it broaden out, and I think a very good example of that is the greater emphasis on third-party risk and attesting to your supply chain and how it is or isn't providing additional risk to your organization.
So that's on you. Not them.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, banking, Andrew. This is the tough one. Banking's been nailed more than anybody, so tell us.
Absolutely, and probably to build on 3 points. With each topic that we see, the first generation is, are you doing it? And it's check the box, yes or no. Whether it's business continuity, information security, a variety of types of topics. Then the next generation is, okay, you're doing it, we're not going to ask that question, but demonstrate, or how did you come up with your strategy, which is that whole risk management view of things. To build upon vendor so that's the approach of first generation, are you doing it? Second is demonstrate, and how are you incorporating risk management? As far as what we see, if we talk to vendor management, that is a continuing evolution and maturity level. First it was, well, do you have a vendor management policy? Is there an NDA in your contract? Check the box off. Then is, have you incorporated your necessary privacy components, whether it's for healthcare, HIPAA, or financial services, GLBA, whatever the appropriate is, like, are you doing a better job? Next generation was how are you assessing the services, whether it's SLAs or their level of performance. Now it's the going second, third generation. So if you're doing a SaaS, well, is that vendor hosting all your data, or are they incorporating subcontractors into the process? And how are they evaluating their vendors? So you truly have to go to kind of that second and third generation of areas.
Have you seen regulators become technical enough? Now, there's some specific regulations here that are different from industries. Are they technical enough to actually ask the right questions?
I have definitely seen a maturity, and it also depends on which body, and for those individuals in financial services, whether it's state examiners all the way up to the Federal Reserve. Each of them attract a different talent pool based upon compensation. Your states are probably attracting a lesser complex type individual. The Reserve, OCC, are much more sophisticated and will present challenging questions and truly expect the material that you're turning over to demonstrate to be well put together and thoughtful.
I know you've seen both because you're under OCC now. And
Correct.
You're under Illinois.
And the FDIC.
Yeah,
And I would say that the OCC is probably the most challenging of the components.
So now we get.
Can I add on real quick?
Go ahead.
The conversation about regulators being sophisticated enough to do proper assessment of an organization's risk posture, I think is a really interesting question, because I think the only answer is it depends. And this is part of the challenge, right? We talked about how the regulatory environment has moved from a very compliance-focused, very checkbox-focused into a more of a risk view. And to have that risk understanding or risk-based conversation is a more sophisticated conversation and is highly dependent upon the experience of the auditor. So you'll often have people come in, and I forget who it was, mentioned about advanced endpoint protection. Well, the story was, did the auditor ask, are you updating your signature files? Well, no.
Brad from Velocity.
Yeah, there you go. No, you're not updating, and that's good. I think in the financial space with the SEC and other regulatory bodies, one of the big failures that we saw with the financial explosion, what was it, about 10 years ago now, they didn't know the complex trades and complex structures that were being put in place that were being traded against the CDOs. Because they didn't understand the CDOs and because they didn't understand the market, they couldn't properly understand the risks that the CDOs were making and the systemic risks that they're bringing into the overall market.
Doesn't just mean cyber.
Bingo.
It means technical, business process.
The whole gamut.
Yeah, financial models.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, of course, always somebody's going to be at a loss. But let's go to the least outside regulated industry. And so how does it work there? I mean, is there enough impetus from other outside parties or self-policing, or what are the things that are driving you and can?
Yeah, I mean, for us, I think we honestly strongly believe in self-regulated model, right? Because when you look at the regulations, HIPAA or GLBA, and you still constantly see breaches and data exposures coming in, right? And I think none of them are, when you establish that benchmark, the people are trying to get to that benchmark, right? And we know that, for example, if we go back 10, 12 years ago, nobody talked about data loss prevention, right? Even though data exposure is the biggest thing, right? No regulator talked about it. So I think that's a laggard that they're going to try to catch up to it, right? So, we believe that, public-private partnership, and I know Todd was talking about 13 different frameworks, right? And I think taking one of those frameworks and sticking with it, right, either it is NIST 800 or whatever that may be, I think the organizations will achieve a much higher level of security, right? And if the regulations turn out to be more, hey, if you don't do this thing and these are the consequences that you're going to face, and not necessarily be very prescriptive in nature, I think we'll see a lot more, better security programs.
Wait a minute, tell us what drives you then. You don't have a regulator telling you got to do this or that. You said you'd like to see industry, maybe you want to see more company in the industry, but right now we're not seeing that. In your space, where are your actual pressures that are making you're not compliant to, it doesn't even have to be compliant to. So what are your pressures for improving your cybersecurity?
I mean, purely it's the question of business survivability,
Okay.
right? I mean, it's you got the consumers, you got the users, and it is a very capitalistic model and society. Where in which case, if I don't do it, I'm kind of onus on losing that, right? So, and the cost of these breaches. I mean, even of some of the regulated or not regulated industry and what they have to go through after something has happened. And those testaments stand to stay good, right? I mean, so I think it's about, to some extent self-mandate has to happen, because I'm not sure, even if you 100% go down the regulated model, how prescriptive you can ever get to, right? It's always going to lag behind by a few years at least.
True, that's true. I don't know, Andrew, you think that banks can say that?
Well, I would argue that you are regulated by the SEC, and if you do have a breach, you do have...
Absolutely, yeah.
You do have 404 and SOX disclosure components to it. And if you look at the impact of multiple non-regulated companies where they've had to come to the table and disclose this information, so you may not have true rule-based formal regulatories, but there are disclosure and financial risks.
And the increased regulatory pressures or increased regulatory teeth, rather, that we're starting to see with the FTC is interesting.
True. And then I kind of think the sleeping giant is insurance. That's to me, it's they're just starting to do deeper due diligence in companies, and I have a good relationship with a law firm that specializes in breach response, and they represent insurance companies, and they're busy often denying claims.
Yeah.
So think about that. Okay. I want each of you to tell me, a little more specifically, like you tell us a little bit about regulators that seen today. But let's get to a little bit of more red meat on this. What are those tough spots with regulators? And it's okay to talk about, in your case, Karthik, these higher level kind of pressures. Give us the really tough ones, the things that you have a hard time meeting, the things that you feel like are difficult to, or maybe unreasonable to attain.
I don't know if there's anything that is unreasonable to attain. Everything costs money,
Everything
right?
costs money.
And time.
Money.
And time and money is a bigger
For
challenge.
DirecTV.
For DirecTV, for AT&T, right? I mean, I think it is money and time, right? And
All right.
I think everybody's in a pressure situation right now.
Arlen?
Yeah. If you'll pardon me for doing this, I'm going to twist your question around a little bit. I think, listen, every compliance, every regulatory framework is going to have parts of it which you throw your hands up in the air and you go, this is silly. Now, why is that silly? Maybe it's just it doesn't apply to your sector, your industry, your organization. Maybe it's dumb. Maybe it's so lagging, because all frameworks are lagging, that's just the nature of it, that the world has passed it by. Fine, so what? I caution people to hang their hat too much on those types of statements. I look at them as excuses to say, as a reason why regulation or compliance frameworks are bad or wrong. The reality is, while compliance does not guarantee security, I can guarantee you that if you're not compliant, you're not secure.
Good point.
Right?
Good point.
Now, the last point that I'll make, as I hijack your question, so pardon me.
That's okay.
I was actually rather surprised to hear a number of people up on the stage actually, if not say this directly, get real close to it. So let me kind of pull this out from what I've heard. We need more regulation, not less. Okay.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Now, where we need more, actually maybe we need more and less. Where we need more is a single federal framework where it brings consistency across all states, all municipalities. I didn't know Chicago was doing their own. That's blowing my mind. Across all states, most sectors, at least a baseline privacy and consumer cybersecurity model to bring consistency and predictability for corporations. I think the very fragmented industry-led, we're going to self-regulate, is a terribly failed model that is super hard to justify and defend.
Well, where I think, or what, because we know cybersecurity framework and that, and the horse has been beaten somewhat, but where I'm seeing conversations get more continuous, and not just from bank regulators, but also from publicly traded audiences, is the whole concept of separation of duties and user provisioning. And it was one of those things where, and it will have an impact from a financial, because when you're doing certainty towards your financial reporting, are you presenting risks when you're provisioning a user that has too broad access? And from a regulatory perspective, they're truly starting to ask the questions of, well, how, when you provision users, are you avoiding a potential conflict of interest, or an individual that has both sides of the transaction? And from a technology and a security perspective, that presents a true challenge or quandary, because if you don't understand the functional framework, how do you ensure that when new software applications are implemented, security is appropriately set? And if you don't understand the business function, you can't factor in, well, there's always from a business leader, well, I have to think in worst case scenarios, and are you managing to the exception or managing to the business process? Technology needs to understand the business needs to truly understand that we'll provision users based upon a common process. So and I'll get on my soapbox for 30 seconds.
Sure.
IT can't operate in a bubble. Security can't operate in a bubble. They truly, and business can't operate in a bubble without each of them knowing their own constituencies.
Right.
The whole McKinsey shared model is timeless.
Yeah.
So.
No, I absolutely get it. Okay, you guys, thumbs up, thumbs down. More attention to regulation or less attention to regulation? Okay, we know where Arlen stands.
Yeah.
Yes, to both.
Yeah, it depends. Yeah.
Depends. Come on.
I say
Let's
get-
stick your neck out for the audience.
I say get rid of the municipality, get rid of the state level stuff,
Okay.
and have it at the federal level clean and clear.
Okay, that's good. Well, a little bit similar to my next question. Thumbs up, thumbs down. You know, government versus industry, or
I think that
process.
I'd go industry stuff, right?
Yeah.
Because it really needs to. I mean, when you talk about IoT and Internet of Things and everything is exploding, you wait for the regulations to come in, as opposed to having some self-regulated consortium-based approaches. You're never going to get there, and the industry sees quite a lot more.
Yeah, I say government.
Yeah,
May I have 2 seconds? Sure. I say government. One of the primary roles of a government is to protect the populace, and as a consumer watchdog for the populace, what we've seen clear unequivocally with not only the number, the frequency, and the breadth of the breaches are only increasing. It is clear evidence that self-regulation is a completely failed model, and we need, just like when government said you need to have seatbelts in your car, and it saved a lot of lives, they stepped in, they regulated, we need better privacy and security laws at the federal level.
I would like one set of rules, because when we get into states, so whether we're talking, clarity.
Yeah.
So I don't need to be verbose about it.
Okay. So what can we do? What can we do now to make it better? What can we do now to improve our security posture? You know, do we go to our industry and say, hey, industry association, let's get together? Do we go to our clients and say, hey, clients, please, in your industries, help us, define these better, or help us, work with others there? Or do we go to government entities and tell them, you need to do better, you need to get better clarity? Everybody should ask for more teeth, right?
I think it's got to be,
Yeah.
the government has to establish the regulation, but the prescriptions have to come from the industry, right? So it's a public-private partnership.
Okay.
That's more essential. We do that even today when you see some threats and intel. Now there's a lot of public-private partnerships, right? There's a lot of collaboration between law enforcement and the private sector, and that's exactly what needs to happen, right? If you need to get to be more prescriptive, you can establish the framework at the federal level and establish that regulation, but then getting to that prescriptive level, that's got to be public-private partnership.
Yeah. It's the industry that's often educating the government, right? That says this works, this doesn't work. And then the role of the government is to lay it out, do the enforcement, have the consistency, clarity, and then get rid of, every state having their own version of notification and what makes up for privacy law.
These are like the Ohio State just had some kind of...
Ohio just did it. And you ask about what are practical things that we can do. It's interesting. I think there are two big practical things that we can do. One is saying that we want it. And the reason why I think it's super important that we say that we want the feds to step in and regulate is because the word regulation has been spun over the past 15, 20 years to be evil, wrong, or bad. Mm-hmm. It's not. It's just a thing. There's good and there's bad. There's overreach and there's underreach, right? So just getting out there and saying that you want a central or regulatory framework that acts as a consumer advocate and protects privacy is super important because it gets it out in the conversation. And then number two, vote. Vote for people that are mimicking your position.
Too late.
Got to wait a couple more months now. Yeah.
Okay, Andrew, here goes to you.
All right. Well, from a practical sense, while you're doing policy advocacy, I think it all starts, and Tom mentioned, where does the CISO come from? Well, it comes from business, it comes from technology. It all starts with entry points, whether your help desk. Does your help desk know the population of the applications that they're supporting, of the users? Does your help desk understand what your company does? What's the culture? Making sure that your technology team is not operating in an isolated bubble, making sure that your software groups are actually working with the business units to properly align when you're doing an implementation. So it's making sure that when you're having the risk assessment conversations, that the CISO and their staff are not doing assessments in isolation. It's making sure that your technology team is baking in their software development life cycles, security, resiliencies, user provisioning. So from a practical sense, technology is part of an organization. Technology needs to understand the business values, the business strategy.
Yeah, how do you can't codify that quite necessary relations.
Well, anyone who's a technology manager that's not having a regular conversation with business leaders and knowing that's not a part of the strategy discussions is not contributing to the solutions.
So we can't live in a society where everybody could just do what they want and let the market forces kind of let it fall where it may.
Yeah, it's a 1-2 punch, right? You'd have the guardrails and then have prescription, right? So how do you define that?
There you go, yeah, and just find that balance, how much of it, So at the end of the day, it's like nobody really disagrees. We're just getting the devil's in the details.
Yep.
Unless there's somebody else really wants to throw one out there. No? Look at that, I didn't expect it.
No grenades.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.